Welcome to the How HR Leaders Change the World podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Crossley, and each week we explore how the work of HR leaders is also creating positive social change, contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, goals which the world's companies are increasingly understanding the urgency of achieving and investing in the action required. If you'd like clear, actionable ideas for how you can use the power of your role to affect change in your company, you're in the right place. Following a corporate upbringing, I founded the social enterprise From Babies with Love. We provide services to HR leaders, and through this work, I realised that HR professionals and social entrepreneurs are working in the same areas, albeit in different ways. So we created this podcast to share knowledge on steps we can take through the work of HR. In my opinion, if you're an HR professional, you are also a change maker. And this podcast will provide you with examples of how. By sharing the successes of some of the world's most inspiring HR leaders, you can frame your work in the context of positive change, implement brilliant ideas, and feel absolutely wonderful about doing so. A big welcome to Catherine Ward, the former Global CHRO of the British Council. We're really delighted to have you here, Catherine, and I'd just like to share that I have a special place in my heart for the British Council from a previous role I had that, I was privileged to work all over the world, and it was for voluntary services overseas, and their offices were often quite close to yours. And so I've had lots of lovely little experiences of doing something of an evening with one of your team members to save me, sitting in a hotel room all by myself. Lots of lovely, friendly colleagues that kind of looked after me and showed me round. And I will always remember that fondly. And in fact, even though the organisation was called the British Council, I actually think of it as a global organisation. You are in over 100 countries, I think I'm right in saying. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective today. And yes, may I invite you just to introduce yourself briefly?
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad you had such a lovely experience in your time you spent talking to people from the British Council. So I left the British Council at the end of March. So it's only very recently that I've left. And I was the Global Chief Human Resources Officer. We did indeed work in over 100 countries, and some 12,000 permanent employees work for the British Council, and another 20,000 who dip in and out supporting projects and programmes around the globe. And before that, I had two other CHRO jobs. One was with Interserve, the Construction and Facilities Management Organisation, and before that with BMI Healthcare, which is a private hospital chain. And what I'm doing now is I sit on 3 boards as a non-exec, and I'm also just started my own business, which is delivering coaching for women around the globe.
Thank you very much. And as I say, I'm the wealth of your experience is just going to be so fascinating for our listeners, and especially thinking of all the different places you've supported people and all the cultures that crosses. Yeah, it must have been a fascinating role to have had. So with that, I will dive into our first question, which is, as an HR leader whose influence creates social change, what do you feel has been your most impactful action to date?
Well, it's hard to disentangle my personal interaction and that of the British Council. So probably the British Council is where I was involved in an organisation that had the biggest sweep and impact on social change. So as I said, we've worked in 100 countries, and last year we engaged with 76 million people worldwide. We worked with 60 different governments worldwide to help implement English language programs, and 10 million teachers worked online with us, downloading materials and programs. So the scope of that is absolutely extraordinary. So as a member of the executive board, I was involved in developing the strategy for the next 5 years and aligning the people strategy to that. So that included looking at things like talent and succession, diversity and inclusion, as well as ensuring that everybody in the organisation had learning opportunities that enabled them to take advantage of this huge spread of opportunity working in an organisation of that size. But more specifically, over the last year, and you touched on this in your introduction, we've all had a very challenging year in HR with the pandemic, and there was no exception in the British Council. Many of our centres were closed. Our English language teaching and exam centres were closed. We had to switch over at very short notice to digital solutions, which had been in development, but suddenly were being implemented on scale around the globe. And my job then came to be supporting the organisation through all of that. So making sure that everybody across the world could work remotely. Obviously, an IT department did the techie side of that, but I was doing the softer side, making sure everybody had the equipment and really understanding the challenges people had about switching to working from home in very, very different circumstances, multi-generational families, and working perhaps not necessarily in spaces where it was easy to get access onto the broadband, competing with other people for it. And so my role was a much more general one of making sure that everybody was being listened to as to the needs they had. I set up a comprehensive comms program, town halls with 1,500 people at a time tuning in, newsletters every week, and an extensive program of drop-in sessions, different training and development events to do with well-being, resilience, how to make your technology work, leadership for working remotely, and just generally I saw that my social impact was on getting us all through this period still intact as an organisation in a reasonable frame of mind.
Yeah, and nobody underestimates how involved and enormous that challenge is, especially across so many geographies. And just thinking about what you said about when you're on the executive committee and contributing to organisational strategy by delivering the people strategy, and you mentioned the talent management program being part of that. How do you, or what would your best tip be for creating a talent management strategy that does take into account so many different cultures for where your people are?
Well, of course, this is, I think, one of the most critical things for HR directors to think about. And I've done it 3 times over in those 3 different CHR roles. So part of it starts with dialogue. I think it's really critical that HR leaders stand up and be counted on this and lead the dialogue. And then I think there is a real piece about just doing things. It's very easy to talk, but it's about actually putting in your succession planning processes and finding the people that will change the representation you've got at different levels within the organisation and really spotting them, putting them onto programmes, bringing them to the attention of the executive board, nurturing them and mentoring them. So my advice is get practical, look across the world, identify who your high flyers are and make sure that they are getting noticed and recognised and into your succession planning, because it's quite easy for them to be below the radar of your programmes unless you consciously make the effort to deep dive and actually find those stars, because there will be plenty of them, and just make sure that you capture them and make them grow.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is as the rate of change and the impact of technology, the opportunity technology creates to work with teams across the world anyway, but the pandemic on top of that in terms of working, doesn't matter where you are, you can work in a team and what have you, subject to time zones and everyone being too knackered at silly o'clock, I suppose. But that type of global cross-cultural working is only going to grow. And so talent management, taking that into account and being practical and making sure no one gets overlooked is a really important part of making the most of that opportunity. Brilliant, thank you. And our next question, we focus in on an industry at this point. And so I don't know if we do that for the British Council and think about international development or think about foreign policy. I don't know, because I sometimes think of the British Council as, I know it's not a government entity, but I do think of it as being friends with the Foreign Office, perhaps, is the way I should say it. Anyway, let me leave that to you to describe. But it's really to think about the kind of sector-wide opportunity that HR professionals have in that sector to make a positive change for the world. What would your thoughts there be?
Well, I think, yes, what is the sector of the British Council? It's development, it's government, it's public sector. And probably the easiest thing is to think of it is in terms of public sector and public service, to generalise the sector. So I think that, like all industries, however, we're absolutely at this most extraordinary kind of point in time. And an absolutely extraordinary point in time, post the pandemic. And I know it's been very tough for a lot of HR people having to deal with really difficult issues. But we are coming now to a rethinking of how we work and where we work. And I think if ever there was a time when HR could sort of stand up and really make a difference, it's now. So hopefully most HR departments have actually proved their worth over the last year in a way that perhaps isn't always so easy to do. But over the last year, I think everybody probably has proved that they're a voice that should be listened to. And now is the time to really capitalise that and say, actually, how do we want work to change? So there's quite a lot of simplicity talk sometimes, let's just create flexible working. But I think it runs deeper than that. It says, well, what are the parts of our work that work well remotely, that the technology works well to deliver, can make us more efficient, free up our time? And actually, which are the human sides that we've learned over the pandemic we still need? So I think innovation, creativity, team building, complex problem solving, actually, and just that interaction and belonging and nurturing and building a particular culture, the things I think most people feel have been missing from the remote working experience. And so HR are in this extraordinary situation of saying it's not just about incrementally changing for the next 12 months. It's about saying, let's reimagine how we can work in a way that preserves the human side of work and the people side of work that we all love, but actually harnesses technology to deal with things that perhaps can be done more effectively. And I just feel we're poised on a threshold here. And I think it's the most exciting moment to be working in HR and a real moment for HR professionals to say, actually, I was part of that change.
Yeah, it's such a wonderfully optimistic and exciting thought to have. And I was just wondering, do you have like a dream of what your dream reimagined new way is, or is that still kind of in development, or is there something that you just think before might have seemed totally radical but now actually feel like I think I could get every stakeholder on board for that and would it happen?
I think it's still a work in development, but I can kind of imagine a very different use for coming into work. So it would be for dealing with complexity. So over the last year, there were times where I thought, if only we could get everybody in a room. And it's because that sort of real problem solving and thought processes around innovation and breaking through barriers happens when people work together over several hours. And if work could become physical work, could become that, where you all come together to do those things. And actually the mechanics of work are the work that you can do from not only from wherever you choose, but whenever you choose. That the technology supports you to work to your own sort of time system. So you just get that done when and where suits you. And then you actually just come together for if you like, the most interesting parts of work, and that we recreate space and reimagine workspace to deal with that. I guess that's the dream. And I think probably most people have some sort of idea like that in their mind as to what it would look like. But it's several steps on, even from just working flexibly.
Yeah, I feel like if I was asked before now what that would look like, I don't know that I could. I don't know that my mind go forward that many steps, even though I'm sure they'll actually come quite quickly in the next few years. Somehow it's still an unknown to me when I think about it, but nonetheless exciting and a huge opportunity.
But I think the challenge for us is not to just try and recreate work as though it was a blend of what it had been before and what it's been over the last year, and just sort of try and bolt those two bits together. Even if it takes us 2 or 3 years of iteration to get to a different place, is to keep on challenging and pushing and saying, this is this moment to reinvent work. You've basically done work in the same way for decades. And here's a chance to say, no, we're not going to just roll forward gently. We're going to really seize this to reinvent and redesign.
How HR Leaders Change the World is brought to you by From Babies with Love, and this episode is sponsored by our very own parental leave gift service. We help solve the challenge of connecting with colleagues across parental leave and in returning to work, contributing to talent retention and so too gender balance strategy. From Babies with Love donates 100% of its profits to orphaned and abandoned children. Your beautiful, sustainably sourced From Babies with Love gifts come with the story of how your company is also helping a less fortunate child, creating meaningful engagement. We transform spend that so often already takes place on flowers or products that don't have the Sustainable Development Goals at their heart. We transform that spend to become a consistent, inclusive and strategic part of your working parents programme. Ask us to tell you more at frombabieswithlove.org. Make an impact at a defining moment. In our next question, we love to perhaps find out a little bit more about you personally and ask if there's a particular area of social or environmental injustice that you personally care about, but then linking that back to your experience in HR and ask if you have any examples you'd like to share of how your work as an HR leader has enabled you to make a change in that area that you're particularly interested in.
So I've always been passionate about diversity and inclusion. And I think from the point at which I became a CHRO, I realised I could directly influence that. And then had a responsibility, of course, to directly influence it. And so I think, although my interest has been generally around all aspects of diversity and inclusion, and I'll perhaps come on to another one later, I've been very interested around gender and the position of women at senior levels. And we touched on about succession planning, but I think that's so crucial. And again, it's about challenging the established patterns and the established norms. So when I worked, a couple of examples really. One is when I worked in Interserve and was working part of that construction business. So the construction business was a very male business. There were these first sort of wave of women who had done construction engineering at university starting to come through. And they were then sort of late 20s, early 30s. They were absolutely fabulous women. But you had this sense that this was quite fragile. And as they got more and more senior, there was a real risk that unless you were giving support and nurturing, somehow the weight of the existing system would make it very difficult for them to progress. And of course, with those kind of qualifications, it's quite easy to go and work for a completely different organisation, the sort of mathematical capabilities that they have. And so I think that was really supporting women with coaching, with making sure they had access into all the leadership development programs, really being proactive about giving them visibility, making sure they were properly represented in all of those aspects of development, visibility to senior leadership, and in all the succession planning, progressing them through. And that did lead to women going through and into more senior jobs in what had been a very male-dominated area. And if I go back another step before that, when I worked in the hospital group, there was this pattern of the heads of the hospitals being men and then the heads of nursing being women. And we changed that quite quickly, actually. And that was driven as much by needing to expand the pool of people we had who could take on leadership jobs as we grew the size of the business. But we shifted that so that by the time I left, it had gone from almost all those jobs being filled by men to 50% of them being filled by women.
Amazing.
And just by a rethink, just by a reorientation of what the skills were needed in that job, and the relationship between the senior clinical job and the senior business leadership job. And actually you could cut those different ways, which would enable women from nursing backgrounds to go into business leadership jobs.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goal 5 is gender equality. So it's a great example that shows just how directly the work of HR leaders is helping to achieve goals and change the world. And actually leads us wonderfully into our next question, which is just focusing in a little more on equity and inclusion, and how you feel you've best used your position to bring about greater equity and inclusion in ways that are delivering the business goals of the organisations you've worked for. And so I was wondering if you have any other examples you'd like to share.
Yes, there is. There's another one, which is social mobility. So when I worked again in Interserve, which had a large number of jobs on the facilities management side, which didn't require formal qualifications, and therefore lent themselves quite well to allow for social mobility for people who came from backgrounds where they've been educationally disadvantaged and hadn't necessarily had the opportunities to gain qualifications as they'd gone through education. And we developed a work opportunity program. So that enabled huge numbers of people just to get a first experience of work. And that led into, for those who are interested, a pre-apprenticeship program, which again gave basic skills training, which meant people could then have access into the apprenticeship program. And the number of apprenticeship places I tripled. And actually the number of graduate places I also doubled. And some of the people who did apprenticeships were able to move over and work towards getting a degree. So there was a pathway that ran from work experience, and so giving access to people into work, right through and into the apprenticeship programs, and for some right through and into degree level qualifications. And that had at its core quite a very conscious intent to allow for social mobility, as well as providing the organisation with the skills that's needed, and to broaden its recruitment campaign much more broadly than traditionally had been the case. And that was very satisfying, actually, to be able to go into postcodes which traditionally had difficulties giving people access to work, and to be able to provide them a route into work.
A wonderful example of the role of business in more broadly, and the role of HR in reducing inequality. I mean, that has so many impacts for those individuals, and therefore their families, and therefore their communities. And I love seeing I see more and more on social mobility in I don't know, in the press, on my social media feeds, LinkedIn feed. I feel like 10 years ago, maybe it's just because I don't have a background in HR, but I feel like 10 years ago I hadn't even heard of that phrase in the context of HR and recruitment and pathways through organisations and career development. But I feel like it's a really established element of people strategy that does have social impact across the board now, or really quite broadly. I'm sure there's still lots more to do. I'm sure that any social mobility experts listening will say the work is far from done. But yeah, it's a great example to hear, because I imagine at Interserve you were already doing that before everyone's LinkedIn feeds were full of social mobility programs.
So we had a big sustainability program, which was, I have to say, slightly ahead of its time. And a core element of that, so it's the environmental piece, but a core element of that had social responsibility within it, which included social mobility, but it also included really being able to give back to the communities where Interserve was working. So that's where construction was going on, or whether there was a big site where we were providing services, that sense that actually there had to be a very conscious drawing in of recruitment from that area, and so that then the wages went back into that local community again. And it was quite a conscious drive. And again, those kind of programs were developed at the executive board level. They were heavily championed, actually, by the chief finance officer at the time, and about half of it had an HR element to it. So he and I were quite shaping and leading in terms of the programs we needed to design to make that strategy actually deliver.
Yeah, and it would be, if I may, just to compare that in the British Council and social mobility therefore being created in communities all around the world, where inequality may be greater than it is in the communities Interserve workforces are in. Did you find a similar approach, or were you able to implement a similar approach at the British Council?
I think that the circumstances are different. So certainly around the world, we were recruiting from the local communities again. So that was very deliberate. I think there the issue was, how did you get to the very top jobs? And certainly that has shifted from a position where most of the top jobs in the British Council, the very senior ones, country director job, were filled by expats. In fact, about a third of them were filled by people who were from the local community, a local country, and that was shifting all the time. But that was actually where the main focus was how do you shift away from using expats in your key jobs to open those roles up to people from around the world.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear. And thank you for comparing and contrasting that. The work of social mobility is it's an enormous area and applies everywhere. So great to hear positive change happening. And our final question, Catherine, is possibly, well, most people tell me it's the hardest one because it's the quickest, shortest one, perhaps, but it's because we like to get really specific so that for our listeners, if there's something they would really feel that they're striving to implement change in their own organisations and really want to just make a start and do something, what is it that they can practically put on their to-do list in the coming weeks? And so it's to ask you if there's just one specific action that you would love to see your peers and everybody in the HR profession take to create a positive change for the world. What would that one action be?
So, as I said, I think it's time that HR can stand up and be counted. So I would actually put on that list wellbeing in connection with work design. So as I said, I think this is the most exciting moment for HR to really play a major part in actually leaving a legacy for the future in terms of how work can be done. And even though that might, as we've said, take a little time to iterate into its right place, I think getting on the table now that people's well-being is a crucial part of their contract at work, if you like, and to properly address that right from the very outset, I think is critical. And I know that HR have sometimes struggled over the years with this identity. They don't want to be seen to be too soft, or they won't have a voice at the table, and so that they need to have a very business orientation. This is one where actually that sweet spot can exist of saying, actually, if you want to be an employer of choice, if you want to hang on to people, if you want to take them with you this journey that comes up ahead, then you need to think about their well-being in a very holistic sense. Their mental well-being, their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, and to have that sitting at the heart of your people proposition as an HR leader.
It's a wonderful call to action, Catherine, and the way you describe the opportunity to leave a legacy. I mean, what a brilliant way for us just let's end there, because there's just so much to that. And I feel like we've actually only just skimmed the surface of some of the very big topics that you've covered in our conversation. But thank you so much for sharing such brilliant examples of your work on how you've changed the world. And it's been so wonderful to listen to you. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of How HR Leaders Change the World. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a moment to leave a review, a 5-star one please, that would be a huge help to achieving our goal to reach more of your peers, so we can all contribute to further and faster positive change. For your copy of the show notes, head to frombabieswithlove.org, where you can also join the How HR Leaders Change the World mailing list, and make sure you don't miss out on future episodes and bonus materials. And for harnessing the power of your role to create positive social change, I'm sending you a jumping up in the air virtual high five. See you next time on How HR Leaders Change the World.